helpful perspective.
Great, thank you very much for the opportunity.
Yeah. Okay, with that, we are now going to transition seamlessly in 2 minutes into our first panel session for the day, which is going to be on building online discourse that works. Just going to get help, just wait for everybody, all the panelists to turn their cameras on and get set up for this. Okay, so I think we're all here, so we can sort of gradually start this. This topic is particularly close to my heart. In this session, we're going to try and address, at least make a start, some of the challenges of trying to build a sort of sustainable online transparent discourse, both among scientists and between scientists and the general public on the one hand, and scientists and policymakers. And one of the things one realizes very rapidly and very painfully with the kind of project or initiative that we've been embarked in is that just because you have a platform doesn't mean meaningful things are going to happen there. And there are actually many challenges associated with having online exchanges in a meaningful way for science that certainly weren't apparent to me in quite this way at the beginning when I sort of first embarked on this. And I think there are many challenges here also that tap into issues that, despite decades of research on discourse, decades of research on argumentation, haven't really actually been the focus of sustained research attention. So I think there's lots of things when you start to come to think about building an effective online discourse that we simply don't know. And the goal of this session is to kind of get us a little bit underway with these questions and this process. We have a panel of 5 panelists to this end. I'm going to be very brief in introducing them, and I will do that as we go along. We also have 3 of the panelists who will be giving short presentations, really just to sort of set the scene and get everybody on the same page. But really what we mainly want this to do and to be is a panel discussion. And again, so your questions and comments in the chat, those of you listening, attendees, please include those. So without further ado, I'll get going with our first speaker and our first stage setting presentation. This will come from Pat Healey, who's at Queen Mary, University of London, and has spent many years looking at the emergence of communication systems, and will, I'm sure, have something to say not just about the context in which we understand each other, but also in the many contexts in which we completely fail to understand each other, often without being aware of this. So Pat, please.
Okay, hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, great, okay. So I'll probably give you an illustration of how easy it is to be misunderstood. 10 minutes, right? I've got a few things to say. I'll try and do them as briefly as possible. A starting point for me for thinking about these kinds of issues is the idea that communication tools are integral to the success of science. And that's not my observation, that's Bruno Latour's. He wrote an essay in about 1990 about what distinguishes modern scientific culture. And he was interested in, throwing away answers like we've got better methods, or we know how to do deduction, or whatever. His point was actually the really salient difference when you walk into a lab is the amount of equipment that's devoted to producing and mobilizing representations of the scientific work. So he was thinking of things like graphs and printers and plotters and so on. And the way he put it was modern lab equipment is mainly for turning rats and chemicals into graphs and papers. I mean, the machinery for science communication now, of course, is much more complicated. Different ways of distributing and documenting representations of scientific work. There's PowerPoint, preprint servers, Twitter, TED Talks, dashboards, trackers, all sorts of different ways. And this has led to a corresponding explosion in the volume and speed of production. When I was thinking about this, I was reminded of John Oberlander's aphorism that you haven't had an idea until you've written it down, you haven't written it down until it's been published, and it hasn't been published until it's been cited. So there's this kind of really fundamental aspect of scientific endeavour, which is about producing representations of work and using those to sort of press your argument. What's, I think, not right about that way of thinking about it is these are broadcast conceptions of communication. So it's a focus on the artifacts of the process, like papers, but it sort of ignores interaction. So what I mean by that is that ordinary conversation is all about dynamic, moment by moment, mutual adjustments in language use. We don't automatically understand each other. Conversation is not just a matter of speaking. It's a matter of sort of engaging in a dynamic effort, collaborative effort to understand one another. And we have rich multimodal resources for doing this. Like a couple of illustrations, like about 1 in every 3 turns in conversation contains some kind of edit or amendment or real-time adjustment. I really like Nick Enfield's observation that the most common, or one of the most common words in conversation is "huh." It's about once every 84 seconds, he estimates. And of course, that's people signaling they don't understand, and it seems to be universal across languages. So those processes are essential for building shared understanding. When we want to engage constructively with each other, we have to go through this effort, real-time, dynamic effort, to create shared understanding. And that's especially critical when we're communicating with people with different expertise or goals or concerns. So especially when it's across labs, when it's across disciplines, even more so, when it's across sectors, even more so. And science is absolutely no exception to this. People routinely misunderstand one another, and they have to, one way of thinking about the reviewing and refereeing and publishing processes is a very sort of drawn out dialogue in which those processes of those conversational processes have been stretched out in time and across different materials. One of the things that technology mediated communication does is it interferes with all of those conversational processes. So it makes it harder to do very simple things like ask a clarification question. It's just harder in a text chat than it is face to face. And some of that is because a lot of the rich multimodal signals are gone. A lot of it is because it may be small cycles, but it's still asynchronous. I cannot frown or raise my eyebrows while you're writing your tweet. So the sort of real-time feedback that you would get normally, routinely in conversation is kind of removed. And that's, I think, an issue for how it's not a technical problem, it's just that we have to think about engineering these systems as being to support the discovery and resolution of misunderstandings, rather than more efficient ways of distributing statements. A lot of people are pointing out, quite rightly, that there's a deluge now of, the sort of increase in the level of document production by scientists, especially recently, has shot up. But there's an equal and opposite observation, which is the level of conversation has shot down. So, I no longer have any informal corridor conversations in my lab because nobody's there. This kind of video conferencing, it makes it difficult to have any kind of informal chat beforehand, or meeting people at lunch, or all of this sort of extra conversational elements have actually, I think, been, I don't have a quantitative evidence for this, but my own experiences, they've been really diminished and taken away. So there's been a big shift towards these kinds of monologue versions of science and a decrease in the dialogue versions. I guess the last thing I was going to address, and this is where I'm definitely right outside my level of expertise and comfort, is the idea that we can improve the kinds of interaction that go on online, and with these massive document archives that we now have using machine learning and AI. Now, I don't think there's any in principle problem with that, but the way those techniques currently work is, well, there's several things to say about them. One is that they are never exposed in the data sets to the kinds of phenomena I'm pointing to. So that the sort of rich, defeasible signals of misunderstanding and the processes by which they get resolved in conversation, they're just not in the data sets. The things that these transformers are trained on, it's almost all documents. So it's missing those things, and so but they can't be sensitive to them. There's a kind of, again, it's not an intrinsic technical problem, it's just a kind of side effect of the way these things work is they tend to be a sort of statistical snapshot of language use across an entire population at one point in time. So they're missing the diversity of differences in interpretation and also the processes by which they get resolved. So they don't model the local dynamics of meaning change and use change. Although you could think of ways in which they would, it just so happens that they don't. The machine learning is for practical reasons optimized for the very large document collections that can give you such power in certain kinds of application. I would like to see systems that are able to look at, where is the change of meaning maximized? Where are people changing their minds? Where is their constructive engagement on the ideas? Rather than, say, looking for where particular words get propagated or particular memes. I think there's something really interesting to do around the idea that we take seriously our misunderstandings with each other and see them as really useful points from which to try to get a better debate going. Sorry, I've stopped, Ulrika.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Pat. Just a quick follow-up on your AI point. I think just for me, there's and this might be a useful clarification for the wider discussion. I think there are two separable but possibly interacting uses of machine learning, natural language processing, and AI in the context that we're talking about today. One is document summary, right? Document retrieval, summary, evaluation. The other is the fact that our online debate at the moment is happening using extant social media tools. Like even for our stuff where it's built on top, and that discourse is algorithmically mediated, right? There's AI underlying that. The content is promoted, it's pushed, it's spread. And we need that too, this algorithmic mediation is something we need to get a hold of as an academic community, understand in its import and figure out ways to do that kind of who to connect with who and what kind of content to promote in such a way as to maximize the actual epistemic goods that science is after, as opposed to maximizing advertising revenue. So just as a clarification. There's a request in one of the Q&As, if you could maybe pop into the chat some of the references to the articles you mentioned from the 90s. If you can't do it now, you can send them to me later and I will pass them on. Would any of the panelists like to say anything to this immediately? We can also come back to issues, but I'm going to give you an opportunity to indicate whether you'd like to respond to Pat immediately. No, doesn't look like it. So there's a lot there that we'll be returning to in the panel. Then I suggest that we move on to the second sort of scene setting presentation by Namkje Koudenburg, who is from Groningen and is here specifically because I came across a co-authored paper that she wrote together with Carla Rose and Tom Postmus about comparing how disagreements are navigated online versus offline, in online versus face-to-face discussions. And she's going to tell us a little bit about that research now. So please, Namkje.
Yeah, I prepared a couple of slides, but I think the research quite nicely fits to Pat's perspective, in which she outlines the importance of these dynamics between people in engaging and creating an understanding. The research that I'm going to discuss here is research in which we compared online and face-to-face communications, and especially focused on the regulation of disagreement. And it's because we feel that online there seem to be more fertile grounds for conflict. Conflict seems to escalate more easily online. So we wanted to see how disagreement is regulated face-to-face in order to learn from that on how we build constructive online environments. Now, there is a kind of a classic viewpoint on how a technology changes societies or changes behaviors. And this seems to be built on the assumption that technology leads to some kind of psychological change in individuals, which then leads to behavioral change. Kind of to give an example, which is quite well known, I think, is that online people are anonymous. Therefore, there is a reduced accountability of their actions. They psychologically feel less self-aware, and then they can display more aggressive or anti-normative behavior. They feel less inhibited, and therefore polarization or conflict is likely to arise. Now, the evidence for this idea is somewhat limited, and there's also some contradicting findings, and we would like to propose a kind of a different idea of how this works. And this is that technology gives certain affordances for behavior, and behavior is therefore directly a result of these technological affordances. And the interpretation of this behavior, the changing behavior, may lead to psychological change and may also lead to societal change, such as conflict. Now, the type of affordances that I'm talking about are those affordances that help us navigate disagreements, which are kind of usually diplomatic tools, diplomatic skills that we have and that we use in face-to-face environments, but that we cannot use that well in online environments. And I'll give you two examples which we focused on in our research. And the first one is linking to conversational flow. And this is very much linked to Pat's talk about how people periodically affirm one another by saying little things like, aha, yes, mm-hmm. But it also relates to a smooth turn-taking. And these behaviors produce a sense of conversational flow, which makes communication efficient, which enables understanding, which also signals that people are on the same wavelength, and that they kind of which signals that the relationship, the underlying relationships, is kind of okay. This means that as long as a conversation is smoothly flowing, we kind of infer that other people will probably agree with us, and things among us are okay. Now, because conversational flow is so important, it also allows for to send subtle signals when there is a disagreement or when are things not okay in a conversation. So when somebody says something outrageous, something we all disagree with, we can communicate disagreement very subtly by means of flow disruptions. So we can frown, or we can hesitate, or we can pause for a brief amount of time. And these disruptions seem to be very very effective ways to communicate disagreement and to let other people know that these views are, their views are being rejected. So it's a diplomatic tool. The relationship isn't really threatened, but it communicates that views might not be shared. Now, when we think about these, how we manage conversational flow online, this is much more difficult. And I'm focusing here on text-based chat. Here we typically have to do with asynchronicity, and it's more difficult to have a smooth turn taking. It's also more difficult to affirm other people in this conversation. And therefore, we believe that solidarity and shared cognitions are less likely to emerge in these types of conversations. Another thing that we expect is that people, that these subtle tools for communicating disagreement, such as frowns and hesitations, are less likely to be used because the medium doesn't afford these type of subtle indications. So people are likely to be more explicit. Now this brings us to the second affordance that we see in that we think is important in regulating disagreement, and this is ambiguity. Ambiguity relates to the hedges, disclaimers, vague expressions that we make when we give our standpoint on a certain thing. So ambiguity is typically seen as a very polite form that prevents controversy. So people tend to ambiguate their statements in order to first see whether their statement may be shared among other people. So they first say like, okay, I think that it might be something like this. And then when they've tested the waters, they are more likely to commit to this viewpoint. And this is very effective in reaching a common understanding because it leaves some room for interpretation and therefore helps other people to find commonalities and thereby develop a shared viewpoint. But again, this is also something that is more difficult online. So ambiguity is more difficult. There are less subtle social signals, such as to reject other people's viewpoints. And therefore, people are kind of enforced to communicate in a more explicit way. When they are making statements about their opinion, they tend to be more explicit. And we think that this contributes to the likelihood of experiencing conflict and polarization. Now, we tested these ideas in a study in which we compared face-to-face and online interactions. And in this study, we had both a condition in which people were talking face-to-face and condition in which they were talking in text-based chat. All groups of participants went through these conditions consecutively. And there were a number of controversial topics that they discussed. And importantly, we always had a confederate that introduced disagreement in these conditions. So for instance, on the topic that they discussed here, which was whether women would be suitable for top positions, this was among students, so most students would actually agree that women could lead businesses. The confederate would say something like, I don't know, evolutionary women are simply not used to lead groups, they're used to care. So a highly controversial standpoint in this discussion. And what we wanted to see is how people would manage this disagreement. What would people do after this controversial statement had been introduced? And we analyzed the message content. And what we found was that in the chat condition, people were much clearer in their statements. Whereas in the face-to-face condition, people were much more ambiguous. They used more things like maybe, sort of, and contradicting speech. Now in the second graph, you see that responsiveness, the extent to which people respond to the previous statement is much higher in the face-to-face condition. Whereas in the chat condition, the messages seem to be standalone arguments. So less likely to have this turn-taking and responsiveness to one another, which is important in having conversational flow experience. Now, the last graph suggests that there were no actually differences in expressed agreement or disagreement between conditions. So even though people do not express explicitly more agreement, the form by which they speak may still contribute to the experience of conflict and lacking solidarity. Now, I want to give you a small illustration of how people actually talk. These are actual excerpts, and you would never read this first thing in a chat. It feels very unnatural. So in the face-to-face condition, someone said, "So then I do not really agree with it, but I do agree actually a little bit, because I mean, it is the case that women always, well, women have children, and you are nevertheless in any case a bit more together with your family," and so on and so on. So what you see is that this person is very hesitant, so doesn't seem very sure of their opinion. But you also see that this person kind of is concerned about how other people might respond to the statement. So they try to formulate it a bit ambiguously to test the water to see whether this is some viewpoint they can commit to. The second one is a very standalone, explicit opinion that is posted in the chat group. So I do not agree with it. I think that the assertion that it's naturally determined is not correct. This is a more explicit opinion, and you could imagine that this person might not care that much about how other people think about it, but just sticks to his own opinion. Now, we find that indeed this is interpreted in this way. So what we find is that very clear and outspoken statements tend to be related to the experience that this person is not very polite and that other people are ignored in the conversation. So there's a focus on the own statement rather than on how other people would feel about these statements. In contrast, a high responsiveness is related to politeness and related to the experience that people are not ignored. And this then results in the experience that in the relational consequences. So people experience more shared cognition and more solidarity when they experience conversations to be clear and responsive. Now you see here that there is some behavioral starting points, so behavior that is limited or afforded by the medium that leads to psychological inferences of how these people might feel. And those lead to consequences in terms of relationship maintenance and conflict. Now, I have a last slide about the workshop question, but I might also leave it open for us. I think I kind of want to say, might want to say one thing about building constructive online discourse. And that is that I think disagreement is both unavoidable and also kind of a healthy part of scientific discourse. But we need to make sure that this is not, that disagreement doesn't escalate into conflict. And I think therefore it's important to create affordances that allow people to be diplomatic in their behaviors. Yeah, and I'm gonna leave it at that.
Thank you. Yeah, that was great. And also we'll definitely get back to this disagreement issue, because that to me now also seems like one of the most tricky things to kind of navigate in ways that I hadn't appreciated before, given that science is all about criticism and how we actually do that in a way that is easy to take and constructive and helps us go forward. Again, any panelists who would like to chip in here at this point? If not, then I think we crack on to our final scene setting talk. We're moving from the communication researcher to the kind of, and the general thoughts to the specific experiments about online environments. And now we're moving into the wild in every sense of the word. In that our next and final speaker is Darren Daly, who's a statistician and epidemiologist from in the School of Public Health at University College Cork in Ireland. And if you follow the SciBeh Twitter account, you will have read many tweets by Darren, because Darren is one of these people who has heroically put in huge amounts of time and effort to contribute to the debate about the pandemic in the last 9 months, and just also just provide this kind of public of science service, all using the tools of Twitter. And it's specifically that experience that we wanted to hear him speak about. And so Darren, if you just want to share whatever insights you see fit about what it's like on Twitter, what's wrong with that kind of discourse, and what we need to build in order to build something like that that's better. It's clear it fulfills an important function, but there's a lot that needs to be fixed, presumably.
Indeed. Thank you very much for that. And thanks for the invitation. As I listened to the other two talks, I did realize that I am the research subject all of a sudden. I am a statistician and a scientist in my own right. And so I'm a user of these social media tools. And I try to do so thoughtfully and mostly carefully. But if you were to ask me, if I really understood what it was I was doing on some kind of a deeper level, I wouldn't have the slightest clue, despite being kind of interested in this for a long time. So just to link in a little bit of background, I started using social media kind of back in, it feels like a confessional, like I'm admitting my sins. But I started using social media back around 2008, 2009, when I took my first job as a lecturer in Leeds. And, this was just after the internet had gotten really good all of a sudden. It was actually useful. It was fast. You could connect and do things in different types of media. And we were talking about Science 2.0, and science blogging was a big deal. And so I was really kind of very turned on by all of that, this idea that we could discuss science in detail. We could talk about things after they've been published. We could share that with each other. We could learn, everybody at that time, and all wrapped up with open access publishing and everything else. So it was kind of, a glorious time, so to speak. And Twitter at that time was very much in its infancy, and people largely, I think, viewed it more as like a promotional tool. And you would write a blog post or you would write something and you would share it on Twitter. And so Twitter was a great place to connect with other scientists. But at that time, it wasn't really my perception that people were using it to discuss the science so much, per se. And so then I'd say like around maybe 2015, 16, 17, something had kind of changed, where a lot more scientists, and certainly in my areas of research, so as an epidemiologist and a statistician, a lot more scientists that I were familiar with were coming onto the platform. And so here I was, an early career researcher, and I was enjoying the platform for being able to kind of share thoughts and share links and that kind of thing. But all of a sudden, all of these kind of the big names in my area of research, there were a few of them that had always been there, but now all of a sudden there were lots more. And not only were they getting on to Twitter and sharing their opinions and views on things, they would actually interact and have conversations with you. So I was just absolutely flabbergasted that I could have these discussions, with these legitimately eminent scientists in my kind of domain, and they would talk back to me. I mean, this was just the most incredible thing, that I could ever think of. And so in that way, Twitter was also, a really kind of appealing tool. And so then that was kind of epi before the pandemic. And then the pandemic happened. And, I think what we'll talk about obviously now in the workshop is kind of some of the changes and what's happened since then. But one of the things that I've become more and more kind of directly involved in is responding specifically to kind of flawed ideas and kind of these zombie statistics that kind of persist in research, and just trying to use Twitter as a kind of educational tool to help people understand how we can design better studies, how we can analyze the data, more appropriate methods, and so on and so forth. And so one of the things I was involved in very early on was a collaboration of statisticians, all trial statisticians. And it started with the that initial hydroxychloroquine paper and out of France. And it was a one-arm study, and it was kind of, you looked at this study and you could see immediately that it was pretty nonsensical and that there wasn't much to be learned from it. And so a few people started tweeting about it. As things happen these days, the study comes out, it gets people's attention, people start to tweet about it and discuss it. And then shortly after that, all of a sudden the internet was full of people discussing all of these hydroxychloroquine studies that were supposedly coming to the fore, and they were showing how it was an efficacious treatment for COVID-19. And I was very curious about that. And so I started to look into the clinical trial registries. So we have some openness and transparency in clinical trials world, where the basic characteristics of designs are supposed to be shared online. And so we started looking into that. And you could see immediately that just based on the registry information that a lot of these trials were not going to be well designed. They weren't going to be capable of answering the question whether hydroxychloroquine is actually an efficacious treatment. And so what we started doing was we got a group of trial statisticians together to start actually looking at the COVID-19 treatment clinical trial preprints as they came out, and to start discussing them online, but to start producing reviews written by us and then posted onto Zenodo so they could get a DOI and everything else. And so we had some experience doing that. I think we wound up reviewing something like 18 clinical trials at the preprint stage, and some of them went straight to publication, or they didn't get preprinted first. And so we had done a lot of that. And so those things had generated some discussion online, the studies themselves and also the reviews. But I think one of the things that was more interesting is that they didn't seem to have moved the needle whatsoever in any kind of substantive way. And so that's one of the things I'm very curious about, is that, you know, we'd kind of very naively hoped that people would take our reviews, they would realize that they were independent and conducted by experts, and everybody was named, and everybody, you know, has a pretty good, you know, experience behind running trials and designing trials. And, you know, we hope that people could take our advice as they move from the preprint to the final papers and so on. But it was pretty much the case that that never happened whatsoever, right? The things that we commented on at the preprint stage, when they did appear in a publication eventually, it was usually without certainly any kind of obvious reference to our original reviews, and certainly not any kind of noted reference, but that's fine. So that's kind of one area that I'm really curious about, in how, kind of what the point of it is in some respects. So in terms of talking on Twitter, and people who know me know I'm happy to share an opinion, I think that there's some value in that, in the fact that people, they listen to what they want to listen to, they can pick up some good tips and advice, they can learn things not to do according to people they perceive as experts. But in terms of changing the practices of people who are committed, you know, to doing it the way they want to do it, you know, I get quite concerned about that. And I'll bring up one more kind of instance of this, or maybe I guess two stories, very quick ones. The first would have been Surgisphere, which was, this was supposedly a data set made up of a lot of electronic health records from a large number of hospitals around the world. And this data set was underpinning a number of observational studies that were being published in the area of COVID-19. And very quickly on Twitter, people were able to pick up on how unrealistic these data sounded. The idea, you know, so it wasn't just the scientists per se, or the statisticians, but also data managers and hospital administrators. People were able to come onto Twitter and point out how it just didn't seem at all plausible that these data could even exist, knowing what we know about how computers work and hospitals work and health systems work and everything else. And that actually, I think, considerably contributed to the retraction of those papers in a pretty swift manner. On the flip side of that, there was a lot of conversation that was generated online about another study, an observational study, again, relating the use of PPIs to COVID risk. And again, this was using one of the kind of online companies for generating surveys. And when the original preprint for that particular paper was shared, people were able to turn to the initial table of the descriptive data, and it was very, very clear that the data weren't plausible. There were combinations of characteristics describing these patients, or sorry, these participants in this survey that could not be real, given, and it was conducted in the United States, and given the demographic and socioeconomic breakdown of the United States, there's no way that these data could exist in any kind of real way. And so we talked about that a lot online with a number of people, myself and a couple of other medical colleagues. We ended up writing a kind of more formal review of this and posted that onto Zenodo again. But at the end of the day, the people who wrote the paper included the editor-in-chief of that particular journal that they wound up publishing it in, and they did wind up publishing it with some kind of hand-waving explanations of, you know, what was exactly going on. And one of the things I found very kind of curious about all of that too, And I think one of the things, you know, if you're thinking about this kind of thinking about discourse, is that a lot of people online, and particularly in kind of medical world, there's a lot of conservatism there. And thinking about these ideas, they tend to be more kind of respectful of hierarchical structures and things like that than I think a lot of scientists are. And so this notion that people could get online and discuss a piece of research that was conducted by, you know, highly esteemed medical doctors and researchers, and the fact that we were discussing it online to begin with was already kind of taboo and didn't speak well to our motives and things like that. And people came onto Twitter to share those ideas, and we were somehow motivated, like we were in the pocket of I don't even know what, you know. So it's kind of interesting to watch that play out as well. This idea that just discussing stuff online means you must be coming from some kind of dark and shady place, and you're just trying to ruin people's lives, when in fact you're just trying to stop bad research from being published. So I think I'll kind of stop there. I think that you know, just to echo what everybody else has said, it's been an interesting time with so much research coming out, and that's been the other part of it too. We've kind of had to stop trying to review the trial papers because we all have jobs, and everybody else is back to teaching and back to doing our own research and everything else we do that we all like to think matters. And so it's an inordinate amount of work to take it from, you know, just commenting online on Twitter and hoping some people pay attention, to actually turning things into critique that people might actually listen to. And especially when you do that, you think they're still not even listening. Anyway, so I've got lots of other thoughts about how Twitter works practically, and I'll share those opinions as we get into the workshop. But I'll, for now, thanks.
Thank you, that was great. I think at this point, I'll just immediately bring in our remaining two panelists, and then we can start to unpack all of the stuff that's happening. Just to briefly introduce, we have David Garcia of both the Universities of Graz and Vienna, who's here because he's a co-author on a recent preprint that I found extremely interesting, that was examining discourse on Twitter around preprints and the politicization of that discourse on preprints. So he also does computational social science. And then we have Robert Thibault, who is from Bristol University, who does meta-research and thinks about research and research communication and the kind of records that we need in science to facilitate meaningful discourse. So I would like to ask David and Robert first if you have any immediate responses. Otherwise, I have a few directions that I would like then the remaining panel discussion to kind of go down, while also incorporating questions and thoughts from the audience. So David, Robert, anything you'd like to comment on so far?
Yes, so I would like to comment a bit on Darren's work on Twitter. So I can say that I agree a lot on some of your observations. The idea that some people are taking Twitter criticism as coming from some strange dark room and trying to destroy their careers or cancel their talks or things like that. And in our analysis, we saw some of these examples where papers are getting criticized and this criticism is not getting listened to also. It's in some sort of pocket and it doesn't really get curated or reaches the wider scientific discussion. Well, in other places, we see the opposite. Some papers that don't have sufficient good evidence, like the Santa Clara study, and how they were getting politicized. How we see that is not that much doctors, but people with profiles that say that they're Republicans or Democrat representatives, and how they were the main ones talking about that paper. So there's like two sides of it. One in which sometimes it's not listened enough, and sometimes in which it's listened too much, and it might have a drawback. But that's kind of it. I mean, I'm glad to just discuss in general.
I had some thoughts if I can jump in now.
Okay, so this is the turn taking that's impossible to manage in online environments. We'll persist through the technology. So one, there's many kind of broad themes that I would like to kind of get back to about what's difficult and special about kind of online environments and that we need to be able to fix. in order to make this efficacious. One of them that is kind of implicit in Darren, just because you were last in your presentation there, is, do you have any thoughts on the extent to which some of the pathologies with respect to Twitter are actually arise from the fact that we're combining both a discourse among scientists and a discourse to the general public? And I think it's completely clear that we need to do both of those things. I think also that there's probably value in having at least considerable amounts of discourse among scientists be transparent in the public in something like the current crisis. But it's not clear to me that jumbling all of that into the same conversation is useful. I've been thinking primarily about the fact that, you know, people can just undermine the quality of the scientific debate. But it sounds like there's actually a flip side of that, which might be that it might be just all too easy to ignore the scientific debate because it's figuring and taking place in this low status mixed up medium in a way that wouldn't be the case if this was a dedicated science forum. Would any of the panelists like to kind of speak to that issue?
I'll say a quick first thing is I think that's, you really touched on it there. And I mean, sometimes people talk about the value of Twitter, and there's a lot of value for the individual scientist. There's no doubt that, you know, having some degree of visibility on Twitter leads to opportunities, and, you know, enough opportunities can lead to advancement and all the rest of it. So there's no doubt that there's an advantage for us, you know, from a career perspective to be involved in Twitter. But, you know, sometimes having those discussions in public in some ways, and this isn't to demean, because the vast majority of people, you know, that I interact with, you know, seem to be acting in good faith and seem to be very nice people and all the rest of it. But we know that there is a contingency on a media like Twitter that is, you know, either rude because they don't know any better, or they're rude to, you know, intentionally derail things or whatever. So sometimes these conversations feel like, to me, like you're like the grown-ups talking on a school bus with a bunch of rude children banging around all over the place at the same time, you know, and how do you try to manage that, you know, on one level? And so sometimes in my head, I'm like, you know, this isn't worth it. Like, I can email people or find a different way. But then on the other side of this, we know that it's grown influential, at least it seems to me, in a very real way. The conversation that's happening on Twitter is all of a sudden what's being reported in, you know, newspapers, major newspapers and everything else. So do we want to concede that ground to the people who are trying to kind of muck things up and spread disinformation and everything else? And so I do find it to be kind of, you know, a really challenging perspective from that way. I'd like to just shut the noise out. And I'm just saying personally, and I see what other experts, like, I'm not an expert in the pandemic whatsoever. In fact, I've spent all my time telling people, no, don't listen to me. I don't have anything to say about this. Go talk to these people. But we want those people saying these things on Twitter, but clearly it's a lot of work and a lot of effort that they don't necessarily get maybe as much reward as they should.
Anyone else with thoughts on that on the panel? I mean, I think Namkje's and Pat's point in a way also kind of slightly prejudge this issue, though, don't they? I mean, if so much about discourse is building up an appropriate model of the person you're talking to and working out where they're coming from and shaping a common language, it seems incredibly unlikely that the same kind of conversation and the same kinds of tools and technological limitations that will make conversation good between scientists will also magically turn out to be the ones that magically make conversation good between scientists and the general public, given that they'll have different backgrounds, expertise, needs. Is that an uncontroversial thing to say?
No, I could say a little bit. So I have some thoughts about this, and I think one of the things is that so a conversation in which you're trying to reach a common understanding, as you would expect to have with other scientists, would be very different from a conversation in which you both try to prove your point, or in which you have some kind of grassroots support, which you or some kind of camp which you're trying to convince. So people joining for a certain hashtag. So for instance, if I add a hashtag with sexism to this study that I just posted, I would attract a very different audience, which is more, which may be in it for a different reason, and therefore also communicate in a different way. Because I think as soon as you try to develop camps around a certain issue, it is much more difficult to have this open conversation. So I do think that if you have these different audiences with different goals in mind, that might make it more difficult indeed. Don't have any solution though.
I mean, maybe one of the things about Twitter, which is interesting, is it's quite hard to actually know what the audience is, right? You have far less information about who you're speaking. Well, you get it retrospectively. I guess you get it over a longer cycle, so that you have less opportunity to sort of adjust a message in a way that will work for the people you're speaking to, because you actually don't know who you're speaking to. You know some of them, but you don't know. You can't make the kind of adjustments you could make in this, when you're standing in front of an audience in a meeting or something. I mean, actually, I find this quite hard because for the same reason that you're getting very weird and limited real-time feedback. If we were sitting on a panel, a face-to-face panel, we'd all be much more aware of each other's peripheral movements and gaze and so on, and all of those little things, which would help us to adjust our messages, help us to, make sure we were being understood. And I'm not sure there's a fundamental discontinuity between that and ordinary everyday conversation. It's just that you lose a lot of information that you would normally use to do the kinds of audience design you normally do.
So there's another aspect to Twitter that I want to pick up on, because it leads to it's both a blessing and a curse, I think in conversational terms, which is the fleetingness, right? Like, it's sort of here today, gone tomorrow. It's very hard. The discussions are very ephemeral, and they're not. They don't accumulate really in time. And I think that's there's a sort of fundamental mismatch there in some ways with how the scientific discourse works in a kind of publication record, right? Where it's sort of in the nature of science to kind of aggregate and accumulate arguments and put them all together. So one of the things you can do on Twitter in a destructive way is that you can just keep posting the same crap. Right, and somebody might kind of respond to this one day, but it's like this hydra, right? If there's not sufficiently many scientists to keep up with whatever it is that's being posted there, then this will just proliferate, and you can kind of go through the same thing over and over and over again. And so it's very hard on Twitter, in the nature of the medium, to have any kind of discourse that is sort of kind of trying to accumulate knowledge about something. And that might be another feature that's feeding into the fact that it doesn't get taken so seriously, because it really is easy to ignore. Like, not only do you not have to be on Twitter, in a way it will also be gone on Twitter tomorrow, right? So there's very little social or reputational cost to having been taken down on Twitter, because it's not kind of part of a permanent record. So the kinds of things.
Turn taking on, yes, anyway. So what about the Steven Pinker stuff? So wasn't he hauled, there was some kind, sorry, I didn't read the details. So maybe somebody else knows the details, but a public letter, somehow, I can't even remember what for, but claiming that he was in some way unacceptable. So it didn't, I mean, even though that they were delivered as transient comments, they actually had a big knock-on and reputational effect for him.
So I think there are two aspects of permanence, right? So there's an unfortunate aspect of permanence, which I want to get onto in a second, which is that you can dig things up on Twitter, right? So we now live in this world where there's always a tweet, you can find somebody's tweet from 10 years ago and you can take it out of the context and out of whatever it was and say, this is what this person said. But that's different from the flow of the kind of contemporaneous conversation, which is incredibly chopped up. So if you think even of the kind of Reddits that we set up, or a sort of a focused discussion forum, right, where stuff stays, you can go back and see what people said, and that's here today, and it's going to be there tomorrow, and it's going to be there in 3 months' time, and you know who said what in that conversation. And Twitter doesn't have that property unless you draw on kind of specific tools. Now, I think that's a problem and a fundamental mismatch with science. But at the same time, I think there's a problem for science with online transparent debate. And this gets back to the disagreement issue, which has already come up, which is that it's in the nature of science to kind of critique each other's work. It's hard to publicly criticize people in a way that's kind of face-saving and constructive and kind, because we don't have, there's so many of the tools that we use for doing this that we don't have. And additionally, you're creating a sort of potentially permanent record where things that you said are, are there for a long time. Is there kind of too much there that's not going to work, or is it going to be possible to build ways and new ways of talking about things and schooling ourselves in ways? One of the queries in the Q&A is asking whether there might be training in online discourse at some point in the future that would be useful. Will we figure out ways to do this in ways that are constructive in a suitably designed forum, or is that just a pipe dream?
Well, I mean, I think there's already kind of evidence, and I know there's a world beyond Twitter. That Twitter just happens to be the thing that I interact with the most. But I mean, just a few things come up there. Like, I think that Namkje's point, about the hesitancy, something that I find very useful in terms of how people react to me, and I wouldn't have done this, thinking as a scientist with any evidence behind it. I'm glad that's there now. Would be to say things like my 2 cents, in my opinion, to add those qualifiers in tweets as a kind of, as a very clear signal to the reader, like I'm offering a suggestion here, or here's my hot take. I'm using some kind of a word to make sure that I'm not coming off as someone who's saying this is how it is and this is how it could be. So for me, I think that does give some kind of credence to the idea that we can train and we can get better at this. I think that's definitely necessary, but where that advice exists and everything else is, I guess is still up in the air, but I think it would be very useful at the same time. Just a couple other quick comments here on some of the stuff Patrick was saying. Obviously trust is a huge thing in this kind of a realm, and that trust has to be built over a long period of time. So there'd be lots of people that I can interact with on Twitter now and can shortcut a lot of these kind of problems that might arise in other online or Twitter conversations, because I've had so many interactions with the person but it's been over a number of years. So they're not communities that are built on intense relationships in short periods of time, but it's a lot of low key, in the background relationships and friendships and collaborations and everything else. And there's just unfortunately, there doesn't seem to be any kind of shortcut to that. And it's been really one of the strengths of Twitter is that we can all do that in the same place. And you can, again, I'm sure there's people who are experts in networks and everything else, who would be able to comment on these kind of things. Maybe I get engaged in a conversation, with someone else and we've never interacted before, but I can look at their feed and then I can see, oh, well, they've had a lot of positive interactions with these people I've had positive interactions with. And so immediately I'm starting to think in my head, like, okay, well, I can at least trust their intention here. I know they're not trying to bait me into a fight. They're not trying to insult me, and this kind of thing. And then I'll say one last thing and I'll be quiet. In terms of the critique, this has really been really kind of hard to come to grips with, because there's this balance between kindness and critique. And when there's unkindness, and there's no way for any of us to, to say the same thing about what's kind and unkind, unkindness drives people away. Whether you think that has merit or not, people don't want to participate if they don't feel like the conversation is kind. And so we have to find ways to critique, to maintain that kind of kindness. And one easy way to do it is to just speak in generics. We have rules of engagement. I don't take a PhD student and their dissertation and go through it with a fine-tooth comb and criticize every statistical method, that they use in it. That would be, just completely unacceptable. But we can see things that people do over and over again generically. And so we can write little tutorials, we can start discussions around ideas that aren't linked to specific research outputs. And I like to think those things are received very well. They certainly get shared a lot and everything else.
I got some thoughts if I can jump in there. I guess a lot of what we're talking about is what to do on Twitter once the information is actually out there. And my research kind of goes back a step from that. For the conversation that's on Twitter and on social media is going to be informed by the research that's coming out, by publications, by what's being spoken of in the news. And if we look at how we do research, so Darren mentioned the surgisphere data and the hydroxychloroquine issues, and as a research community, I think we can have, we have power over what gets published, or not as individuals, but as a whole community, we can have checks and balance. We could have better checks and balances on what gets published, which could be a step before these Twitter debates or arguments actually start. And so I guess this conversation is mostly on, once these conversations have started, how do we manage them? How do we ensure they're productive? But I think a lot of the work can also be done before the conversation even starts. And so if a finding comes out that's doesn't have sufficient statistical power and is probably a false positive, but if that's the first thing somebody hears about that topic, then that might blow up on Twitter, and then it's going to be very hard to undo that news. But if we have a more systematic peer review system, where we have specifically hired statisticians, or we have somebody to actually check if the researchers did what they said was in their registration, or whether the results will differ between kind of a prospective registration that's posted online and the actual publication. And so I think we can build in checks and balances throughout our research process, which would hopefully limit the amount of kind of damage control we would have to do afterwards.
I'd like to actually speak to that, Robert. I'm really glad that you bring up the timing issue, because one of the things I've been thinking about with respect to constructive criticism and disagreement and making that palatable is it's actually kind of the flip side of what you've just said. I mean, I think it's true that it's nice if we can minimize the things to disagree on because we're doing everything better. So that's a valid point. But I think one of the things we were trying to do when we set up our SciBeh forum, the Reddits, initially, was that we were really also trying to build a forum and a venue where people could talk about studies before they conducted them, so that we would have pre-study critique. And one of the things that I think is potentially so important about that is that if I think about the moments at which I'm receptive to criticism, how I'm going to respond to being criticized, in a way, the worst moment to have your work criticized is after you've conducted it or published it, right? At that point, I'm massively invested. I might respond completely differently early on before I design the study and think, oh my God, Robert, that was incredibly helpful. I'm so glad you told me that. I would have made this super mistake, and now the study is going to be way better than before. Whereas after the fact, I've done all of this, it's going to be hard to emotionally feel that this is anything other than kind of an assault. And so I wonder if we want to be serious about online discussion about science and doing science online, whether part of the game is really not going to be about moving a lot of our discussion to much earlier on, where it can be most constructive and probably most well received. So that's a thought. Anybody?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. A lot of the research in my field, which we're just researching the research process, tries to improve it kind of late in the process, either identify errors after they're published and highlight that, or to kind of improve peer review. But there's some initiatives that start early on too. For example, publishing format registered reports where you actually submit your introduction and your methods you haven't collected the results yet, and then you get peer review based on your introduction, your methods, and it's more of a collaborative process, and then you get in-principle acceptance. So if your methods make sense, then your paper will be published after you collect the results, or after you collect the data and find the results. So there's some steps like this, some initiatives that are trying to create a more collaborative format. But yeah, we're still in this kind of outdated model of research where we're just kind of putting it out in the end and then somebody's critiquing it. And obviously, yeah, like you say, that's not the best time to receive critique when you just want to get your work published.
I could add to that I think that if you would want to have this, your hypotheses out in the open before, I mean, there's a reason why pre-registration are often under embargo, because you need to create a certain level of trust among scientists before people will be willing to do that. The trust that not somebody else will do it before you. And I think that is why these processes often happen within small lab groups and not online.
So what you're talking about, often called scooping, when you have an idea and you're worried somebody else is going to take it. In practice, when people have been surveyed about scooping, there's not much evidence that it happens. Because I mean, we all have, as researchers, 1,000 ideas that we want to research, but don't have the time to research them. So it appears so far that when somebody else has an idea, somebody else hasn't gone and grabbed that. But yes, it's a fear that I think many people have, for sure. And that limits the sharing before we actually do the research.
So I think there's another aspect to this doing things before, though, right? That's already come up as well. It might be helpful both for the science and for the individual researcher to move more of the criticism to earlier. This then does raise a point that has both come up in both in Namkje's and Pat's presentations and in Darren's, which is like, it's really effortful to provide comments on things, particularly in written fora that are going to have a permanent record. And one of the things I completely personally underestimated was how long it just takes, to write comments on Reddit or on Twitter that are supposed to be, are supposed to have even just a minimum of quality associated with them. So why on earth would people do that just for the betterment of science? And what kind of incentive structures are we going to have to kind of put in place for that to be a viable thing going forward? There's going to have to be some kind of reward for that.
I mean, the caricature of the statistician, right, is that the investigator kicks down the door 5 minutes before the grant is due, and statistician, I need your help with a sample size calculation or whatever. And that's certainly not me describing the people I work with, who tend to be much better than that. But it's also not a caricature that's completely ungrounded in reality either. And so I do think about this quite a lot, that we're driven, and the incentives conversation this is another nice part about Twitter. It's not just the science, but the kind of context of how science takes place that gets discussed a lot, and the incentives and everything else. And I mean, I think we're all kind of full to the teeth of being aware of where all the problems with the incentives are. It doesn't pay you, to do thoughtful study designs and then hope you get funded for them so you can actually carry them out. You're much better off maximizing the number of grants you put in and everything else. You're much better off not subjecting what you're doing to that level of scrutiny that early on, when there might actually be a payoff in terms of the publications that you and your university want to kind of show off to everybody as this symbol that you've done some good research. So I think I suspect that we'd all agree that the incentives need massive changing. There's a reason why we don't do it like that. I think it's pretty clear why.
Yeah, I would say that there's even these incentives, not just this permanence of the track, but also that some people ridiculize social media engagement across academia. Like we have this idea of the Kardashian index, that you divide the number of followers you have over the number of citations you have, trying to measure how much overpopular are for your scientific credibility. And that's just a way to say this is not worth. You should be publishing more papers rather than talking to the public. So we don't really have this well accepted among academics. When somebody's applying to a conference or to a position, they put their Google Scholar but not their Twitter link. And so I think this is something to fix first. First, not to punish people for trying to engage the public on Twitter, and then see how to reward it.
But given that we're thinking big here, right? We're building beyond Twitter, something that academics build and own, maybe on top of Twitter that filters out some of the garbage, or something different altogether. Like, what kind of incentives do you think there could meaningfully be, David?
So I think we could learn from other examples like this Change My View subreddit, where people are posing questions and they're asking to be challenged. And they have this honest debate in which they might give a delta to the comment that really changed their view. So you have some kind of acknowledgement, and people have on their profile how many times did they manage to change someone's view. So this could be similar. We could have some kind of peer-based acknowledgement of some sort of helpfulness that doesn't have to be built within Twitter, but could be on top of it that feeds from Twitter. And of course, this requires some kind of norm. No, the person in Change My View says like, I want to engage in this kind of discussion, and then I will honor you that kind of acknowledgement if I see that outcome. So perhaps we can have a tweet that mentions one of these platforms and says like, hey, I want to have a honest public review about my idea, and then I will acknowledge the people that actually contribute to it, and then you honor this by having an acknowledgement in the paper or something like that. I think it is possible, and we should have initiatives to try to do these kind of things. I don't know exactly what, I don't have any myself, but it should be doable.
There's I'm not quite sure how to formulate this. So the other side of the incentives is the kind of like in socio-technical systems, the accountability. So where one of the difficult things about social media is you don't quite know how you're going to be held accountable for what you've put in it. So you have the sort of immediate conversation, but as we've been talking about, it can be searched subsequently by a journalist or found or something, and then other people can use it, and we have all these institutional accountabilities where what's in our it doesn't matter what we put in our tweets, but altmetrics, as long as it shows up in altmetrics, that's good and we win, right? And that's the problem for any kind of documented interaction. It's really hard to anticipate all of those different ways in which you'll be held accountable for what's in that thing. The problem is I don't have an answer, right? But that for things like ambulance control recording systems, that's really a massive problem, because once you're recording the calls, then the behaviour of the controllers changes, because they're less willing to say certain things, more willing to say certain others. And then they know that they're legally accountable because the recording of the call may show up in a court case. There's all those multiple layers which make it very hard for people to deal with these things when they're documented.
True, I think that's why you have to acknowledge in the beginning that you want this to be recorded, and say like, okay, I agree that there should be a track and a permanent version of this discussion. Otherwise, if you do it without people's consent and so on, it will be problematic, I agree.
So is this a kind of plea for the fact that there's going to have to continue to be kind of sort of tiers of scientific debate? There's going to have to be informal stuff, and always will be, that happens because privacy is important to fleshing out stupid ideas and not, the half-baked, and that's important for creativity and all that. And then that we'll only be able to move certain parts of the scientific process into the public domain without loss. Is that an intuition everybody shares on this panel, or?
I do.
I'll say something as someone who shared more than their fair share of half-baked ideas publicly. I think it would be, I think it's a good thing. The only problem with it is that there's a lot of, there's a disproportionality in response to that. And, a lot of people are rewarded for sharing their half-baked ideas, and other people are, harassed and hassled for it. And so I think that's an important part of it too, that we have to kind of continue to come to grips with. And I think for me, that's really the biggest thing is, again, as a user of these tools, I think the biggest issue really is again to make these things as welcoming for everyone as possible, and to protect each other, especially when we're doing it publicly and you're open to kind of the critiques and comments and harassment and abuse that can come from kind of all directions. I think that's the biggest barrier for me. Not for me, to be clear, not at all. I'm like in the sweet spot for saying whatever the hell I feel like saying online. As a middle-aged white guy with a relatively secure job, I'm like bulletproof in this regard, and an English speaker nonetheless. But I think those are the things we really have to kind of continue to focus on and find. Well, I'd love to see real ideas on how to make these kind of spaces kind of more welcoming and more inclusive.
Yeah, that raises an interesting point. Also, another unanticipated problem that we had in setting up the Reddits and the forum there is that I initially had this idea that early career researchers would be kind of super into doing all of this, and the more you observe that not happening, the more you become aware of the fact, no, well, actually, the incentives for early career researchers here are completely different, and they have to be really careful about what they say in any kind of public forum like that, which completely undermines the really important point about the epistemic diversity that we need in any kind of scientific exchange for that to have meaningful epistemic outcomes. I mean, I guess part of it is we could do better in science in terms of developing a culture of publicly admitting that we were wrong about things, right? And that being a natural part of science, and that not being something that's held against scientists. And potentially, if there was more of a culture of scientists, including senior scientists, regularly saying that they were wrong about something, I think that could potentially also be assimilated into a culture of, well, this is how science works. But there's a kind of another, and this is okay. And I raise this also because I'm mindful that Steve is Lewandowski is sitting here, and we have the hackathon on COVID denial and climate denial. And there's also a question in the Q&A by Fabio Paglieri, which points at the fact about how the public seems to have this sort of asymmetric interest in transparency, where transparency seems to be important when there's a potential perception that things are going wrong in science or going wrong in politics, and less interest in it otherwise. So are people hopeful that those kind of tensions can be navigated in some suitably designed forum, or? Like, can we really present kind of publicly, and is that working on Twitter at the moment? Like, can we, it seems all too easy on Twitter to weaponize scientific disagreement and amplify it into big rifts that possibly aren't there in the actual scientific community.
I don't think there's a generic answer. I mean, Twitter works for some people, right? The medium itself doesn't determine. Well, I mean, in some ways it does actually, but there's no single optimal way of engineering a system that will promote debate, I would say. It's going to work differently for different people. If you're the white man with the secure job, however else Darren put it, and you've got institutional power, but it's just going to work differently for you.
Yeah, also I think that senior scientists or people with stable jobs, we can do something better to try to activate our juniors. So I see that people in my team, they don't really want to use Twitter. They have accounts, they follow people, but they don't tweet. And when we go to a conference and there's a coffee break, I usually introduce them to other scientists. I try to promote them in this kind of face-to-face version. But on Twitter, I mention them every time I can in a thread or in any common paper or whatnot. But still, that's not working. They're not really forced to interact when you mention them. So I don't know what's the solution, but definitely these kind of tricks that we have face-to-face introducing people just don't seem to work online.
Well, and Twitter might just be the wrong venue because Twitter now already is what it is, and it comes with all these other characteristics, right? But I think also it's not just junior. Like I was never on Twitter before starting the SciBeh stuff. I found the idea of being on Twitter terrifying, frankly. And I think only about 40% of scientists, Steve had a figure the other day, are actually on Twitter. So most scientists still aren't.
In some senses, I feel Twitter is sometimes taking care of part of the job that journals should be doing themselves. So sometimes errors will be pointed out in a paper and someone will send a letter to the editor. But journals will often not accept those, or they say you're only at 300 words, or oh, it wasn't submitted within 6 weeks of the original article. And now that version of record will never have something linked to it that points out it's wrong. So then you're forced to, people have written kind of long blogs that, you know, if they do a replication study and they try to publish the replication in the same journal as the original one, but found a different result, sometimes the original journal won't agree to publish it. And so you have to resort to blogs or to Twitter or to these other mediums. So I think kind of formal publication systems in academia also have a role to play here, and shouldn't just, I mean, they need to update. They're kind of in the state that they were a while ago in some senses, and having kind of updated with the internet and with new times and with our new abilities to communicate quickly. And so some of that conversation has moved to Twitter because we can't have it in the journals.
It's just one of those awkward silences.
I was just going to say, I just wanted to agree with Ulrika's point about the people admitting they're wrong more often. Like culturally, that would be nice if it happened more. The people are too invested in not being wrong.
Sometimes it's easier to say you're right rather than I'm wrong. and with that, you start queuing into actually revising your opinion without acknowledging something too humbling, I'm guessing.
There's a nice commentary in the BMJ recently that Marcus Munafo and George Davies Smith, and I forget the third author, but in the conflicts of interest statement at the end, or declared interest, they say all three of us were wrong on what we predicted about COVID. One author imagined this but was wrong. The other author thought this was going to happen. And it was just really nice to see people, you know, it's not only financial conflicts of interest, but that they can say, you know, one of my conflicts of interest was I was dedicated to this idea. I really thought that was true, and that didn't turn out to be true.
Yeah, but that's where we get, I mean, that's where we get back into linking into seniority, right? So in my world, you know, those are people, you know, George Davies Smith is, you know, he might be on the Mount Rushmore, for American term, of epidemiologists, you know, so it's cost him nothing to admit wrong. Not that he shouldn't have done it, but, you know, like it was certainly an admirable thing to do in the BMJ, I agree. But just to link it back to this other issue, it's easier for some than for others, for sure.
Yeah, but it might be a start if you you could create a climate in which being wrong is normal, and that might need to start with more senior people then. Related to that is the other thing is, I think that you could have trained people to use Twitter. So if we train people to use certain codes of conduct on how to use Twitter, how to appreciate others, how to respond to others, might that be helpful? Maybe.
I feel like that's tricky because, and again, I think there's, you know, social science that would touch on this that you would all know more about than I would. But it feels like this is a place to more like norms and kind of community norms to regulate rather than, I mean, if you look at the, you know, the social media policies at a lot of universities, without commenting on any in particular, like they contain some kind of eyebrow raising stuff. And I'm certainly familiar with people who have been, who have gotten into hot water with their employers, university employers, for critiquing online research, for critiquing research online, and for comments that I'm familiar with, and for comments that aren't in any way, in my opinion, overstepping any boundaries into personal attacks, or, you know, these are things that are kind of comments that are, this is wrong and it's wrong for this reason and this is why you would correct it. And I know people that have been, again, gotten emails and phone calls from, you know, from their bosses, so to speak, about that. So it becomes a little bit tricky, I think, in some ways, how you do that.
On that note,
I think a lot more advice on how to do it. Advice would be great. Like, I'd love to read some more stuff, and will, you know, about things I can think about more in terms of making the way I communicate maybe a little bit more palatable and the rest of it. Sorry, Robert.
No, that's fine. On that note, I've criticized some research through journal publications, and had some neurotechnology companies that didn't like my critique file complaints to my universities. And as an early career researcher, that's kind of frightening, because they investigated me. They didn't find anything wrong because I had published. But what made the process easy was that I'd published in a journal. And so they said, well, there's the peer review. The journal took care of it. But had I written the same thing in a blog or on Twitter, I wouldn't have had this kind of evidence that it had gone through some rigorous system. And then I may have ended up in a much trickier situation in that case. So yeah, there's definitely a potential cost with, particularly, I feel, as an early career researcher without kind of a tenured position or anything, where, you know, critiquing research can land you in an awkward place.
So we're kind of in the home stretch now for this conversation. The session after the break, I know most of you are going to have to pop off virtually immediately when this is over. Pat has to teach. Is there anything, thinking ahead, about kind of tools you might imagine that might make discourse better? If you sort of think about, we've talked a lot about things that are difficult to move into an online thing, but there's going to also be things where an online environment could provide facilitative or supporting tools that could be useful for particular types of discourse, in particular scientific discourse. So just to kind of give one brief idea is, I mentioned before this issue, you're on Twitter, and it happens in science as well, and people just reuse arguments, and they reuse arguments despite the fact that those arguments have been actually refuted quite comprehensively somewhere else. You think in an online environment, it should be possible, and people have been working on these kinds of things, to actually simply build devices that link, right? That say, oh look, here's that trope again. You know, here's an answer to that, and now it's incumbent on you to at least acknowledge that this exists or provide something new. So anything along those lines that you could imagine that might actually make scientific discourse online better than it is in other contexts?
Maybe I have one example. I don't know if it's too anecdotal, but there's this Twitter account called Just Says in Mice, and it just replies to papers saying in mice, because they made some study and they claim that chocolate cures cancer, but it only was done in mice. And it just replies to all sorts of echoes on research, just highlighting that it was done in mice. So I know it's something small, it's anecdotal, but perhaps having these small pockets of correction systematically, boringly, is one way to kind of correct that every time it appears.
Whenever you say something like that, Ulrika, I always think, well, yeah, but is it the same, really? You know, so there's a kind of presumption that there's a kind of, you know, canonical version of an argument, and that's what you're seeing repeated. But I wonder, I guess what I'd want to know is, I'd want to actually do the study where you looked at those repetitions and saw if they really were just the same thing happening again, or if the debate had moved on, or if some of the terms of the argument might have changed, whether people, you know, somehow were picking up on those differences. It's.
I think when you start to look at public discourse, so I spent a lot of time looking at like debates about Brexit, for example, but it's the same with debates about, you know, public discourse is different than a dialogue between two people, and it does have these sort of meme-like you know, characteristics where certain arguments suddenly become popular and they spread, and then they're everywhere, and then eventually they sort of die down again, right? And I think it's in that kind of environment and those kinds of aspects of public discourse that I think tools would be really useful. And Fabio Paglieri is one of the attendees, just been typing in the chat, and I can't read it while speaking. The argumentation researchers haven't really had enough time to study those kinds of public discourse characteristics, right? We've been thinking about argument and dialogue in a very dialectic, two people exchanging opinions kind of way. But a large-scale debate by a scientific community or a Twitter community has completely different characteristics in addition to dialogues between individuals. And I do actually suspect that we can build tools that link together, just like the simple mice example that David just said, right? Where we can, and that we'll need such tools also to combat with the misinformation problems, right? Where you can just outshout a scientist like Darren by just having 100 people post garbage, and there's no way Darren's going to be able to keep up. And I think we need tools for that, but I suspect that some of those tools might also be beneficial even in our normal scientific discourse.
Yeah, you're making me, sorry, your audio broke up a bit, so I didn't hear everything you said, but you're making me think of citation searches, actually, because that's a kind of linking of arguments, isn't it? Where you look for, papers that cited the paper, and then you work out something about the context and the chain of reasoning and repetition. I mean, I like the idea. I like what you're saying about the idea of being able to link together instances of an argument, or, at least ostensibly the same argument and the same evidence process. I do think that would be interesting and useful.
Okay, we're gonna have to stop here because you've run out of time. Thanks so much for participating. Also, please let's continue these thoughts and conversations. Thank you to everybody listening. Thank you to everybody taking part. We will now have a 30-minute break, and then we'll finish with our final session on tools. Thanks, guys. It was great.